Well, hello, and welcome to my mini lecture on Chapter 4. In this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about models of change. I want to begin by first talking about the importance of models in the literature. Most people, probably when you looked at the title of this chapter on models and theories, you probably said to yourself, oh no, please, not yet another lecture or another chapter on theory. Let's get to the good stuff. I think, unfortunately, there has been a misrepresentation about the value of models and theories. For example, unfortunately, models and theories are often viewed in contrast to practice. So we like to think of sort of theories and then practice as being on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so normally this contrast is used to portray models and theories in a somewhat derogatory light. This is unfortunately because one of the things that was noted from the very beginning of our field, you might recall me talking about Kurt Lewin, one of the founding fathers of organizational development, is he has this dictum that says that nothing is more practical than a good theory. And so far from being something that is the opposite of practice, you can see very early on Kurt Lewin drew the importance for theory to practice. And that primarily comes because models and theories give us essentially two valuable pieces of information. Number one, models and theories tell us what things are important. What are the key variables to consider anytime you're attempting to understand and perhaps study a given phenomena? Second of all, models tell us how are these things related to each other, right? So we have these key variables. Is it that A causes B, or does B cause A? Or in fact, are A and B both caused by Z, or perhaps A and B have no relationship with each other whatsoever? And so models tell us not only what the key variables are, but how these variables are related. And if you're going to be of any practical use as a consultant, you're going to need to know these two things. You're going to need to know what things are important to consider in any given phenomena that you're attempting to intervene in, and you're going to have to know how the variables are related to each other. If you're going to manipulate change in a situation, you're going to need to know those drivers, i.e. those causes that play out in any given situation. So once again, far from being the antithesis to practice, models and theories are very important if you're going to engage in any kind of practice. Let's consider some other things about models and theories. One has to do with the fact that there are two types of models. Now, this is not only true in the field of organizational development, this is true in all fields of academic inquiry. One of the earliest types of models were what were called rational models. And by rational, we meant the idea that they were logical. They assumed that people were very much motivated to maintain consistency in their thoughts. In many ways, these models pointed out what people ought to do, or how processes ought to operate, because they were sort of rational deductions of the correct way of doing things. And so anytime you come upon a model that specifies typically recommendations for how you might carry out a given process or procedure, that's a good example of a rational or an ought model. It wasn't long before people began to realize that in spite of models that talk about how people ought to do something, those models didn't typically describe how people actually did something. And so rational models eventually gave way to what are called normative models, which focus much more on attempting to describe what it is that people actually do. And so I typically refer to these models as the is kinds of models. So to give you an example, decision making is a good example. The early models in decision making were much more rational. They were about how people ought to go about making a correct decision. The latter models of decision making were really much more normative in the sense that they really stepped back and they attempted to describe what it is that decision makers actually do. And as it turns out, we got really two different observations from when we consider the distinction between how people ought to make a decision versus how people actually do make a decision. We learned that oftentimes decision making is far from rational. It's far from explicit. It's far from intentional. It's oftentimes covered in biases and prejudices and those kinds of things. And clearly no one would recommend that's how one ought to make a decision. One of the things that I've observed typically when I've been teaching this class in an on-ground format is that many of the debates that students get in about certain phenomena are somewhat laced with this distinction between the ought versus the is. And so oftentimes someone is arguing about how something ought to be, and yet the other person is attempting to counter that with how things actually are in that case. And these are really not competing models at all, in the sense that they're really attempting to explain two different things. And so something that you'll want to pay attention to as you're engaging in your online discussions is this very important distinction between ought and the is kinds of models. All right, so I want to move along and talk about the importance of dimensions of organizational change when choosing a model or theory for that matter. There are different dimensions to consider that are going to help you to judge or evaluate how appropriate that particular model or theory might be. So let's look at some of these dimensions. First one is the notion of level. And by level, I'm simply referring to the fact that change can occur either at the individual level or it can occur at, say, a group level or the organization level, or it can even occur within, say, an industry among several organizations, what oftentimes referred to as sort of supra-systems, if you will. But even within each of these levels, one could further divide them. So let's take, for example, the individual. At the individual level, we could talk about there being change at the intra-personal level. By intra, we mean within, so within people. So, for example, changes in personality, changes in knowledge, right? All of these would be intrapersonal processes. But then there can also be changes at the interpersonal level, inter being between. So in that sense, if we're talking about the friendships that might occur from coworker to coworker, or the relationship that might occur from subordinate to superior, employee to supervisor, for example, those would be more interpersonal kinds of changes. And so definitely certain models are probably going to speak more at one level versus another. Another dimension to consider is this distinction between planned versus unplanned change. In many ways, planned change is deliberative. You can think of it as proactive in nature, whereas unplanned change tends to be more reactive in nature. And perhaps you can see this distinction once again between, say, the ought and the is. Typically, ought models are planned change, right? The things that you ought to do, whereas is models are generally going to focus on more reactive kinds of change more so than proactive. Third dimension to consider has to do with the magnitude of the change. Your book makes a distinction between first order or second order change. One of the analogies that I particularly like is the analogy between, say, evolutionary change or revolutionary change. Evolutionary change is more incremental in nature, and of course it lines up with the idea of first order change. These are small, minute changes that are occurring at a particular point. With second order change, it's much more revolutionary, much more depth in terms of, say, the nature of the change that's taking place there. So much more dramatic. Okay? And then a final dimension has to do with the continuity of the change, the degree to which the change is ongoing. If it's ongoing, we think of that change as being somewhat continuous in nature, versus if it's somewhat more abrupt or emergent, then that tends to be the kind of change that just simply happens. It's more episodic in nature. I think this distinction becomes important because I think oftentimes it influences the degree to which there is an expectation of change in a workplace. If the change is continuous, it's likely that the members of that organization tend to expect change, and therefore they're a little bit less affected by change when it occurs. If change is episodic and therefore infrequent in nature, then change can be a little bit more disruptive because it's simply something that was not expected. So once again, the type of model that one ultimately chooses probably needs to take in consideration the level at which the change is going to occur, the degree to which there is planning ahead of time, the magnitude of the change, and then the continuity of the change. So moving along, what I want to do is to talk about the two major approaches to organizational change, namely the systems theory and the social construction perspective. These two approaches are very fundamentally different in their assumptions of how organizations work and therefore how organizations change. In fact, they're so different that we typically refer to these approaches more as paradigms. A paradigm is somewhat akin to the idea of a meta-theory. A meta-theory is essentially a theory about theories. And so these assumptions really constitute kind of the boundaries and some of the taken for granted rules about even the kinds of theories that ought to be developed in that sense. So we're going to look first at system theory, which has its primary focus on examining the relationships, or namely the interdependencies, that tend to occur between the various components in a given organization. And then lastly, we're going to focus on the social construction approach, which actually tends to bring into question those very components that systems theory talks about as outcomes, and really tends to suggest that those components are really manufactured by the language that we use, and then even the meaning that we give to the various language and terms that we talk about. Okay? So let's turn and first focus on systems theory. This is the most dominant paradigm that is out there. In this particular theory, organizations are reviewed as systems that are made up of various subparts, or perhaps even subsystems, that are quite interdependent upon each other. What you see on the slide is a basic outline of the basic elements of systems theory, in the sense that systems theory sort of begins with the idea that there are certain inputs from the environment, inputs being essentially the resources. Once those inputs come into the organization, then there is some transformative process that takes place. Ultimately, there is an output in terms of either a product or service, and then there is feedback that occurs both back to the transformative process itself as well as back to the inputs. And of course, what becomes extremely important to a systems model is the idea of environment. It's really the environment that determines the inputs and outputs and then the feedback process. And so these are some of the basic elements of a systems theory model. Oftentimes systems theorists like to talk about the distinction between a closed system and an open system. An open closed system would be essentially a system that's self-contained. All of the necessary elements simply exist within the system, with an open system really emphasizing the importance of an environment, the idea that no organization exists in a vacuum and that an organization must interact with its environment in order to survive. essentially, there is no such thing as a closed system. All systems are open systems, but this distinction is made really to refer to the kind of thinking that oftentimes occurs. Much of early organization thinking was somewhat of a closed system nature. Organizations did not pay much attention to the environments in which they existed, and so they acted as though they were all self-contained, and it didn't take them very long to realize that they weren't, in fact, not. Regulation, customer demands and satisfaction for quality, all of those things began to impact the inputs and the outputs of a given organization. So in that sense, all organizations are really open systems, more so than closed systems. There are a number of models that we're going to look at very briefly here, but of course I'm sure you'll take heed and read these carefully as you're reading through them. But I'm simply going to emphasize the ways in which each of these models truly reflect the notion of a system. Okay. Let's begin with Lewin's force field analysis. According to Lewin, this is Kurt Lewin, by the way, the founder was talking about, he suggested that at any given time, excuse me, there are two forces that are acting upon a given entity. There are forces that promote change in that entity, and then there are forces that actually promote the status quo. And if you're going to create change, what you ultimately have to do is you have to increase those forces that promote change, and you have to decrease those forces that promote the status quo. Only when that equilibrium is disturbed will you in fact get change. As it turns out, the force field analysis is one of a staple tool in organizational development, and so this is something that you might ultimately create as a part of your toolkit, if you will. And so let me give you some sense of how this might work. Let's suppose that we are in an organization and we're having to somehow help this organization to shift from, say, using software A to using software B. Well, what we might do is engage in perhaps some data gathering, and of course we'll talk about that in one of our latter lectures here. And what we would be attempting to do is to learn about those forces that promoting change. So we might discover that one of the things that promotes change is the fact that software A is becoming obsolete. It's not keeping up with the times, it's really outdated, and there's some sense that people sort of are aware of that. We might also discover that software B has a lot more bells and whistles, right? People are impressed by that particular change. So both of these two pieces of information would be things that would seem to promote the idea of change. But there are also forces that are promoting status quo. In other words, there are forces that are promoting sticking with this initial software A. And so one force might be that A is actually easy to use and that it's well known. So people tend to prefer things that are easy and things that they know, and so that would be a force that would be promoting sticking with what they have. Also, we discover that B is very expensive, and so that might be seen as a deterrent, and once again, something that's promoting the idea of the status quo. So if we're going to actually get people to change from software A to software B, we're going to have to be able to increase the forces that promote change, either by adding more forces to the mix, right? I only gave you 2, so maybe we come up with 4, or by even increasing the attractiveness of these things, right? So I mentioned the idea of software B having more bells and whistles, right? Maybe even more bells and whistles might be something that might sort of tip the scale. And also have to decrease those factors that promote the status quo, right? A is easy and known. That might be hard to change, but maybe what we could change is perhaps the expense of software B, right? If the expense of software B could be brought down, right, that in fact might be something that would lessen those forces promoting the status quo and therefore lead to change. So that's an example of how Lewin's force field analysis could be used as an OD technique. hopefully you'll see that it reflects very much the idea of a systems model, and that it reflects this idea of interdependency between forces, and then looking at how these two particular forces are very much related to each other if you're going to bring about change. Okay. Moving along to the Nadler and Tishman model. This model puts a much bigger emphasis on the transformational process, so those things that actually occur within the organization. And it also tends to put a heavy focus on the idea of fit. So if you look within the transformational process, you'll see the notion of the informal organization, right? Those informal relationships and friendships take place. The formal organizational arrangements, i.e. the organizational chart, the individual. In that sense, we're talking about the abilities and motivations of individuals, as well as the task, right? What is the nature of the task that has to be done? This model puts a big emphasis on the importance of making sure that they fit. So, for example, if we just look at the task with the individual, right? Do we have the right individuals for a given task? Do our individuals have the knowledge, skills, and abilities for a given task? There must be a notion of fit, right, if we're going to have a transformational process taking place here. So once again, you can see this importance on the interdependencies of the subsystems or subparts in a given particular system. Of course, inputs and outputs reflect the external environment, with there being feedback loops to each of those. If we look at the Burke and Litwin model of organizational performance and change, this model is noted by its greater level of complexity, which was not exactly welcomed with open arms when it was introduced. But one of the things that this model does do, somewhat uniquely, is help us to distinguish between this idea of evolutionary change and revolutionary change. At the top part of the model, where you see things like mission, strategy, leadership, organizational culture, right? These are the processes that are necessary for revolutionary change. If we're going to change the major paradigm of an organization, we're going to have to really impact these particular variables. On the other hand, if we're really engaging in mere evolutionary change, then we can really focus more on those variables that you see down at the bottom of the page. Task requirements, motivation, individual needs and values, right? These are the variables that one would focus on relatively minor changes. So then if we come to Weisbord's 6-box model, this model is distinctive in the sense that it brings us back to this distinction between the is and the ought. Each of the variables that you see here, primarily what you're doing with this model is you're really thinking about these as they are espoused versus these as they actually are. So, for example, we take the idea of purpose, right? We would ask the question, so what is it that we say our purpose is? But then when we look actually at what we're actually doing, does what we do really reflect that particular purpose? And oftentimes there's a big sort of gap between those models. Okay? So the Weisbord model completes our discussion of the system thinking paradigm. Let's now shift and talk a little bit more about the social construction models of change. I guess the first thing to note about these models is that they're not models in the same sense as models that we talked about under the systems thinking paradigm. If you recall, social construction really deals more with the idea that reality is not something that exists independent of our perception of it. That in fact, reality is a social construction based upon the conversations and the language that we actually have come to agree upon. So let's think about this for a minute. If you think about things like job satisfaction or motivation or say even commitment, these are big terms in the field of organizational study. But these are really terms that we have created, right? I mean, you can't really show a person a motivation. You can't really give me 2 ounces of commitment, right, in the way that you could give me 2 ounces of water. And so these are essentially terms that we've created, that we've come to agree upon in that case there. So apart from our agreement on what motivation is or what commitment is, right, there really is no such thing as as commitment or motivation in that sense. So these are really socially constructed kinds of notions. And so the models that speak to change within the social construction tend to focus much of their attention on the kinds of conversations and therefore agreement that people have. So Ford's model is an example of a model that focuses on the idea of conversations. In Ford's model, it's really about shifting the conversations, say, from one paradigm to the other paradigm. And that's how you bring about change in Ford's model. In the Keegan and Leahy model, they also sort of focus once again on this idea of language shifts, changing the language in the organization. And so as you can see, social construction models, which are much more based upon the idea of perception, more so than objective reality, are going to focus much more on the way that words are used, as in the telling of stories, as in language that are used in the organization, and do not take for granted the idea that there's sort of an objective reality out there in that case there. Your book points out that these paradigms can be quite contradictory, so it kind of precludes us from being able to do our usual "it's both" kind of conclusion, right? So this is not as easy as the whole nature-nurture debate where we can simply say it's really both of them, because you can't essentially accept both, not in their entirety, because they really say contradictory things, for example, about reality. Having said that, I do think it's important to point out that regardless of which of these models you ultimately choose, there are important lessons to be learned from the opposing model. So, for example, for systems thinking, let's assume that you've accepted more of a social construction model. I think the things that you'll want to take away from the systems paradigm is, number one, the notion of interdependency. Paying important, even when we're talking about social construction, right? There's interdependency even among the elements that exist there. The importance of environment. The language that's used in an organization is very much developed by the larger culture that exists in which that organization takes place. So environment still becomes important there. Another issue becomes the idea of fit versus the idea of best practices. Systems model, because they focus on the idea of fit, they really suggest that there is no one best way of doing anything, that the best thing for something is really going to depend upon the degree to which that particular element fits the other existing elements that are out there. So it sort of precludes this idea of best practices, or the idea that some way is universally the best way of operating. Perhaps you'll remember this notion from leadership classes. The idea of contingency leadership or situational leadership was really that leadership depends. There is no one best style or no one best behavior of leadership, that in fact it really depends upon the match between the situation and the leadership style, for example. On the other hand, if you take more of a systems paradigm perspective of organizations, and I think there are still important lessons to be learned from the social construction perspective. For example, the distinction between perceived reality versus objective reality. Right? Got to keep in mind that people respond to things how they perceive them, not so much how they really are. So in spite of any changes or any policies that you might exist, it's very important that you pay attention to the way in which those policies may actually be perceived if you're going to attempt to predict or understand people's reactions to them. And I think also the social construction perspective puts a big emphasis on the importance of communication in an organization and paying attention to that communication, both in terms of communication as it's occurring, as well as the kind of communications that a leader might want to have with their employees when they're attempting to bring about change. Okay, so this ends my lecture on models of change. And so I'll simply bid you adieu and say take care, and happy reading.